All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and frankly rapid transformations in modern history, America's great shift from neutrality to the First World War. When the conflict erupted over in Europe back in August 1914, the United States was really just a neutral bystander. Most Americans viewed it as this faraway conflict, fought for reasons they didn't really understand or, to be honest, even care about. But fast forward to 1918, the US had completely transformed into a global superpower, totally unleashing its massive industrial and human potential onto the world stage. It was absolute whiplash. So how exactly did that dramatic shift happen? Let's get into it.
Back in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson's stance was crystal clear. He flat out proclaimed, "We must be impartial in thought as well as in action." At that time, there was literally zero prospect of US involvement. Wilson was absolutely steadfast in keeping the US out of the European bloodshed. He was really hoping to position himself as this ultimate world peacemaker who could just step in and mediate an end to the whole thing. Which brings us to the big question. How did a nation so fiercely dedicated to peace get dragged into the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen? You see, everyone initially expected this European war to be quick, but by Christmas 1914, it was just hopelessly deadlocked. And as that incredibly costly stalemate dragged on, pulling in more and more of the world, America's isolationist resolve was pushed right to the absolute breaking point.
Which leads us to Chapter 1, The Illusion of Neutrality.
Now, in 1914, America was actively resisting war on multiple fronts. Culturally, we had this fierce, deep-rooted tradition of avoiding foreign entanglements, unless it was about commerce, of course. Politically, people actually resisted the very idea of a standing national army. They much preferred volunteer militias for emergencies. Throw in a widespread ethical disapproval of shedding American blood just to prop up European colonial powers, plus some strong pacifist beliefs, and you've got a seriously anti-war public. Oh, and demographically, it was super complex. You had a ton of recent immigrants, especially German and Irish Americans, who harbored some intense hostility toward Britain. All these factors basically created an impenetrable wall of anti-war sentiment.
To really capture the leadership's mindset of the time, look at this quote Wilson delivered in Philadelphia: "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight." Wilson was a progressive Calvinist, right? He took his Christian principles very seriously. He and his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, honestly viewed peace as a healing influence. They genuinely argued that disputes should just be settled peacefully. And, well, it's one of history's greatest ironies that these deeply held pacifist convictions would actually soon become the ideological bedrock for a massive global crusade of war.
But here's the thing. True neutrality? It was always kind of an illusion. Just look at the trade numbers from 1914 to 1916. U.S. trade with Britain and France absolutely exploded, up by 400%. Meanwhile, trade with Germany, it completely fell off of a cliff, dropping to just 10% of its pre-war levels. The reality on the ground was that American neutrality had become totally one-sided. The British had blockaded German shipping, and they were borrowing heavily from Wall Street to buy American goods. So while America wasn't fighting, influential folks quietly realized a stark truth. The entire American economic engine was now tied directly to an Allied victory.
So let's move on to Chapter 2, Provocation and the Breaking Point. Because of that structural reality, continued isolation became basically impossible, and the dominoes started falling fast. It really kicked off in 1915 when a German U-boat torpedoed the RMS Lusitania, killing American passengers and sparking absolute outrage. Germany backed off on restricted submarine warfare for a bit, but the pressure kept mounting. Fast forward to December 1916. A secret report warns that Britain is effectively bankrupt without direct U.S. support. A month later, a desperate Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. Then, February 1917, the infamous Zimmermann telegram gets intercepted. By April 1917, this rapid-fire cascade of provocations forced the inevitable. The U.S. declares war.
Now, to impartially understand the view from the other side, we have to look at just how desperate the German Empire was at this point. By late 1916, the British naval blockade was suffocating them. Chancellor Bethmann Hollowick explicitly stated that unrestricted submarine warfare was meant to make Britain observe humanity in her blockade policy. Basically, they viewed it as a forced defensive measure. The German leadership totally knew this would likely provoke the U.S., but backed into an existential corner, they felt they had no choice but to take the gamble.
But contrast that right away with President Wilson's moral outrage. In April 1917, he addressed Congress and declared, "The present German submarine warfare against commerce is a war against all nations."
For Wilson, indiscriminately sinking American ships was simply the final straw. These were just irreconcilable differences in how both sides viewed the warfare in the Atlantic, and it ultimately forced the president, with a really heavy heart, to ask Congress for that declaration of war.
Actually, submarine warfare wasn't even the only trigger. The sheer audacity of the Zimmerman telegram absolutely shocked the American public. In case you need a refresher, this was a secret, intercepted message from the German foreign minister proposing a military alliance with Mexico to attack the U.S. The goal? Distract America with a massive war right on its own doorstep. Mexico obviously had no intention of doing this, but British intelligence intercepted the plot, handed it over to Washington, and boom. This stunning revelation of secret diplomacy was the absolute, undeniable breaking point.
Let's shift gears to Chapter 3, A War for Democracy. Okay, so once war was actually declared, the justification morphed incredibly fast from mere self-defense into this grand ideological crusade. Wilson's vision for a new world order was breathtakingly ambitious. Remember, he was a progressive Calvinist. He didn't see this as some traditional land grab. He genuinely believed imperialism was the root cause of the whole war, and he wanted to completely overcome it. He envisioned a world of democracies built on free trade and proposed a League of Nations for global governance. This was meant to be the war to end all wars. It was viewed as this once-in-a-generation, God-given opportunity to basically hit the global reset button.
Moving right along to Chapter 4, Mobilization and the Battlefield.
Just take a second to look at this growth. In 1917, the combined American armed forces had a mere 370,000 personnel. Within one single year, that number exploded to nearly 5 million. I mean, calling up, training, and equipping a modern army of that scale from scratch is just a monumental logistical feat. So, for most of 1917, the actual flow of troops to France was really just a trickle. But beneath the surface, the sheer industrial might of the U.S. was being totally unleashed. And by late 1917, the Atlantic was cleared of U-boats, paving the way for one of the largest troop deployments in human history.
And leading this massive new force was General John Blackjack Pershing. Now, Pershing was the real deal, a deeply seasoned, battle-tested veteran. He'd fought in Cuba back in 1898, the Philippines, and even spent months leading a gritty expedition into Mexico in 1916, chasing Pancho Villa. The guy knew combat inside and out, and now he was tasked with commanding millions of untested U.S. troops in the muddy trenches of France to finally finish this war.
By January 1918, fresh American troops were pouring into France at a truly staggering rate. 250,000 men every single month. Just wrap your head around that. After the brutally costly, muddy deadlock of 1917, this immense influx of manpower completely shattered the balance of the war. Once the arrival of American troops hit that fever pitch, the sheer mathematics of it all meant that defeating the Central Powers was absolutely no longer a question of if, but when.
And honestly, the collapse was spectacular. Germany launched this desperate last-gasp offensive in the West. It had some initial success, sure, but it was ultimately blocked, largely thanks to the sudden weight of those fresh American reinforcements. Once that failed, things moved at lightning speed. The Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria all collapsed. On November 9th, the German Kaiser abdicated. 2 days later, an armistice brought a ceasefire to the most destructive war humanity had ever seen. American intervention had undeniably forced a decisive military outcome.
Which brings us to our final chapter, A New World Order.
As the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world was just forever changed. It really leaves us with a profound question. Did America's leap from an isolated bystander to global savior actually establish a lasting new world order? And what was the true cost of abandoning that historic neutrality? Because think about it. Alone among the great powers, America emerged physically unscathed, its economic power and prestige massively amplified. What started as a rigid moral policy to avoid foreign entanglements eventually just bowed to the crushing forces of international trade and strategic necessity. Woodrow Wilson really tried to win the peace with his idealistic visions, but regardless of the treaties that followed, a permanent shift had happened. The United States could no longer pretend the rest of the world was just some faraway concern. The modern American superpower had officially been born. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer as we trace this incredible defining leap onto the global stage.